I'll start. I'm Asada, and I'm with Works, which is a group that's based out of Crenshaw, or California, connected to the downtown Crenshaw Rising movement. And the top of mind question for me is one of the members who's not here, Jeff and I, really have gotten excited about the idea that what we are going towards is a multi-stakeholder cooperative, and wondering what is the legal framework for that, knowing that it has a defined place in law in Canada, and in Italy, but wondering, how multi-stakeholder cooperatives are dealt with in the legal code in the United States.
Cool. Appreciate that, Asada. Josie, you want to go next?
Hello, I'm sorry, I'm out walking, but I'm with Reverend Burnett's group. I think it's Consciousness Agency. Reverend Burnett can fill me in.
Josie, that's Josie from Baltimore, and I'm Reverend Burnett from Baltimore, and we are intending to build a wellness modalities cooperative with a number of people who do various and different wellness modalities to bring these businesses together to own a cooperative that's jointly owned and operated.
Okay. Any legal questions top of mind for you?
What the possibilities are in terms of structure. What kind of options do we have in terms of structuring this so that it works with the ideas that we have about connecting small business people who are already doing wellness modalities together? How do we connect and in a legal structure that's, that works? So we're just studying to begin that process.
Okay, we'll touch on that. Maybe, is it Asia?
Thank you.
No, you're welcome, Josie. All right, maybe if Asia's not ready, Eve, you want to go next?
So, good to see you. Happy you're here. Thank you. I'm with Asada and Asia and the Crenshaw folks with Works. I guess the only corporation or legal structure that I haven't really heard much about is a B Corp. So maybe just something a little bit about that would be useful. Thank you.
Bet, no doubt. Kimberly, you want to go next?
Hi, yes, Kimberly Armstrong with the Baltimore Green Justice Workers Cooperative, based in Baltimore. And I'm glad she brought up B Corps, because I know a little bit about B Corps, and I know it's kind of functions like a nonprofit, for-profit kind of business, and you got to go through a lot of certifications and stuff like that. So, but we are structured currently as a nonprofit. So I think that through your presentation, I always get a lot of questions that pop up in my head as we talk these things through. Thank you.
Okay. Let me see. Next person I see is Eartha.
Yes.
You want to do a quick intro, which co-op you're with, and did you have any legal questions that are top of mind?
No, not basically. I'm just glad we're covering that. It seems like we live in a land of law. So like I said, there's so many laws out here that we definitely need to have someone that's experienced in all of these legal issues as we move forward to make sure that we are following in those guidelines.
Okay. I hear that. I think the next person I see is Lynn.
Hey, good evening. I'm with Kimberly and Eartha with the Baltimore Green Justice Workers Cooperative. And as Kimberly said, we're set up as a nonprofit. Our initial thought was that the trainings that we're doing for our trainees, that this would be an opportunity to introduce them to the concept of co-op so that they have the opportunity to buy in. But we also figured that if we were going to do that, then we should probably go through the process ourselves. And so I guess some legal questions would be similar to Kim's in terms of the structure being a nonprofit and then creating a for-profit arm of the co-op that would be run by the trainees, and whether or not we could do multiple co-ops within the nonprofit structure if we decide to do that.
Awesome. I can touch a little on that. Next person I have here is Antonia.
Hi everyone, my name is Anthony Zwogu. I am a UCLA student working with the Crenshaw group. I'm actually studying, creating a feasibility study for a future co-op for the group. And so one of my legal questions is probably about thinking about in the future, what kind of language needs to be in contracts that we might consult with other groups or any partnership contracts that might come forth in the future.
Gotcha, thank you for that. And this, how do you pronounce your name? Is it Antonia?
Antonia.
Antonia, bet. Sorry about that.
Nope.
And then the last person I have is Abundantly Wealthy Stan. Just quick intro, what your co-op is, if you have any kind of legal questions that are top of mind. Just thinking about.
Trying to unmute my mic. My mouse wasn't getting over there. Let me turn my camera. I don't know if I'm camera ready today. Just kidding, y'all. I did not have a co-op in mind specifically. I'm part of Burnett Jones' team to learn more about co-ops and what we're doing and where we are in doing the wellness modalities. So, so that's where I am with that.
Awesome, thank you for that. I think I've covered everyone. This part of the presentation is always really helpful because it can kind of cue me in on what you all are thinking about and give me a sense of what I might need to slow down on and spend a little bit more time on. So I appreciate you all. And obviously, I'm sure there'll be questions that come up throughout the course of our evening together. And you should feel free to either raise a virtual hand or probably do a virtual hand. Might be the easiest, or coming off mute could be fine as well. So I'll go ahead and share my screen real quick. Can folks see my screen?
Yes.
All righty, let's see here. Slideshow. All right, cool. So when I've done this presentation before, I don't think I typically go the whole 2 hours. And so I just want to preview that for folks. You should be able to get some time back this evening. At the same time, that kind of depends on how much in the way of questions folks have. I'm available until 8:30 Eastern Standard Time. And so that's something I'm committed to, but it depends on kind of what the flow of the conversation is. So this evening, we'll be talking about business law for worker cooperatives, sort of 101. As I mentioned before, my name is Julian Hill. I use they, them, and he pronouns. I teach at Georgia State University's College of Law. I just started there about a year ago. I used to teach over at Georgetown for a couple of years. I'm barred in New York, Washington, D.C., and Georgia at the moment. I also have an organization I've been working with that we are converting to a worker cooperative, which is Yo Habla LLC. And it's a formation through which we use hip hop music to teach Spanish. And so I'm one of the founders and I make most of the music. So that's a little bit about me. So I've been on both sides of this sort of co-op piece, both as someone who's done an incubation program and someone who's obviously done this teaching piece. So here's some of the goals I've laid out for this evening. I want to kind of ground us at the outset around the legal context within which like Black-led worker cooperatives are operating, I think that context is really important and is unique and worth naming. And I'll talk about the implications a little bit later. The second goal is to kind of understand some of the potential pre-work that folks will need to be thinking about and doing prior to developing and forming a legal entity. The third goal is that you'll be able to understand some of the key legal matters that are going to be relevant for your Black-led cooperative enterprises. And finally, to kind of have a sense of when you should talk to an attorney. The hope is that the presentation will put you in a place where, if we think about formation as an 8-step process, you start at step maybe 4 and can ask more informed questions and have a more nuanced conversation with an attorney, because hopefully we've been able to surface a lot of the major things that you would need to consider. So those are the goals, and here's the agenda. So we kind of did our check-in of sorts. I'm going to do a little exercise around some of the legal context in which you all are operating, and understanding that the law is a very much so capitalist, reformist enterprise, and notwithstanding that, just being able to think through how do we try to be creative, notwithstanding those constraints. I'll talk a little bit about healing restorative justice, just because I think that's something that is often something that cooperatives I've worked with have asked about, but also I think it's something that folks should be thinking about. And then the bulk of the conversation will be on a day in the life. And so I'll just talk about legal considerations for worker cooperative formation. That'll be the bulk of our conversation. And so I know people were talking about possible structures, B Corps. I won't be touching a lot on nonprofits in that particular section, but in the 5th section around other considerations, we will have some time for that. Depending on where we're at on time, we'll either take a break after other considerations or possibly before, like a 10-minute break, but people should feel free to take care of your bodily needs and other needs throughout the course of the presentation. Like, I'm not going to be offended. It's recorded. You can always go back and look at it. And then we'll just have some open discussion and closing. And so throughout, there'll be opportunities to ask questions, make comments, but there'll also be some time at the end. So with that, is there anything that folks wanted to talk about this evening that they feel like is not covered in this agenda that I should be aware of? Okay, I don't see no responses from folks, but well, keep me posted as we move through. We can always, whatever's not covered, we can always talk about in open discussion and closing. Cool. A reminder, this is not legal advice. This is educational talk only, right? So don't go off talking to folks and being like, well, this attorney said this, and because of that, this X, Y, Z. It's important to note that I'm not barred in any of the states where you all are operating. And so there's going to be some different nuances in California and in Maryland that might have some important implications that I might not necessarily cover in full detail this evening. All right, but the idea is that you can ask some sophisticated questions. Cool. All right, so first part, just want to talk a little about legal context and do like a little bit in the way of an activity. So I'm gonna play a video. Well, we're gonna listen to a song. And I want you to reflect on these 3 questions. So what was Fannie doing? It's Fannie Lou Hamer, in case you can't tell, with the picture on the right. The second question I want you to be thinking about is who benefited most from whatever the activity is that Fannie was doing in question 1. And then the third thing I want you to be reflecting on is was whatever was happening, whatever dynamic, was it legal at the time? All right, so what's going on? Who benefited from what's going on? And was it legal? That sound good?
Yes.
All right, that's what I'm talking about. All right, so let me go ahead and get this video popping. Actually, let me hold up real quick. Share my audio. My audio is not sharing yet. Just give me one moment. All right, there we go. Stop share. What's going on? And I'm gonna share it again, and this time I'm gonna show my sound. All right.
And when my mother, we would be racing, picking cotton to see who could pick the most. One of her little favorite songs was jump down, turn around, pick a bale of cotton. Jump down, turn around, pick a bale of day. Oh, Lord, I'll pick a bale of cotton. Oh, Lord, pick a bale of day. Jump down, turn around, and pick a bale of cotton. Jump down, turn around, and pick a bale of day. Jump down, turn around, and pick a bale of cotton. Jump down, turn around, and pick a bale of day. Oh, Lord, pick a bale of cotton. Oh, Lord, pick a bale of day.
All right. So, were folks able to hear that?
Yes.
Yes.
So what was going on? What was Sister Fanny talking about or singing about?
Cotton, picking cotton, sharecropping, I think.
You think correctly, Asada. You get 10 points. Toward
Mhm.
what? I don't know, but you got 10 points. Yes, she's talking about sharecropping. And all right, so sharecropping activity that follows what was going on post quote unquote emancipation. Black folks living on property, oftentimes owned by the folks who were their former slave masters and slavers, however you want to call it, working for little to nothing, right? Barely subsistence, right? And so the second question is, who benefited from this arrangement? When we think about all the stakeholders who were involved, who was benefiting from that arrangement?
I guess the people that owned the land.
Yes, owners of the land,
Yeah.
capitalists, some might
Mhm.
say. And was it legal? Was that arrangement legal?
Yes.
Absolutely. So 20 points for Asada, 10 points for Lynn. What that means, we will talk about a little bit later. And so why do I have us kind of start off with that? Well, one is I always like to talk about Fannie Lou Hamer because she's dope. Definitely someone who played an important role when it comes to thinking about obviously our civil rights in the South, but also very involved in the cooperative movement. But also, too, I want us to be grounded in the fact that the law is and has historically not been very kind to Black folks, right? And so we have this whole arrangement rooted in the exploitation of our labor. That is just one iteration of so many different legal systems, so many different policies, so many different engagements with legal actors that have led to our exploitation as people, right? And so I don't come into this conversation naive about that fact. As a lawyer, I understand the harms that the law does. I mean, we could talk about criminal law and other spaces, but it's also present in corporate law, right? And so, so what we're going to try to do here today is figure out, okay, understanding that this is what we're dealing with, how can we sort of move forward and try to build not just institutions that are rooted in different politics, but institutions that can also help us think through how do we kind of rearrange our relationships to each other, our relationships to our labor, and building a different economy. Okay, and so again, historical exploitation of Black labor, use of law to continuously disempower us, and law has been a tool to facilitate our exploitation and continues to be. But we're gonna figure out some ways to try to move, notwithstanding that. All right, and that's just the real. Any reflections or thoughts on that anyone wants to share before we move to the next phase of the conversation?
I like that you started there. I like that you started that just because something is legal doesn't mean that it's going to be in our best interest. You know, I really, you know, and like you said, historically for Black and Brown people, that has been an experience for us, even out of slavery. You know, slavery was legal at a time in this country, but it certainly wasn't for our best interests. And so I appreciate, you know, you starting with that point of reference.
I want to echo that. I was talking to my coworker yesterday because we got invited to be part of the New Economy Coalition, and she was like, "Well, I don't know if we're eligible because they say X, Y, and Z," and I was like, "But we are eligible because we say A, B, and C," and we were just having this moment, and it also just reminds me that just because it's not legal doesn't mean it's not something that we have a vision for that should happen, right? The law is not something that tells us right or wrong. It's just the rules that are put in place by the decision makers. So that was helpful to me too. It was a little liberating too, to remind ourselves not to only think in terms of the possibilities in terms of the legal system.
Awesome, thank you for that, Asada. Now I just want to lift up in the chat, Asia mentioned we have to know where we come from to move forward. Anyone want to give a last thought, reflection before we move on to the next piece?
Well, I think that bringing this up just makes us mindful of how we position ourselves in this current economy and in relationship to any legal issues right now, as well as some advocacy roles that we get to play in impacting and shifting whatever that legal system is. So it just helps us to be mindful of that context that we're doing this in, the environment we're doing it in right now. So I appreciate that too.
That's great. That means goal number 1 has been achieved, at least for 3 or 4 people who spoke. Eartha, did you want to chime in as well?
I always look at law as playing a game, and people make rules because they're trying to win. So it all depends on who's trying to win. Is the people who own the game or the people who play in the game? And basically, since we're playing the game, is the reason why we have to learn the law, because as usual, the rules will change as we learn them moving along, because the people who make the rules are trying to win. So that's the way I look at the whole situation.
Awesome. Yeah, no, I think those are some really important, valuable insights. Some of that stuff that I was hoping you folks would bring up, some of this stuff that that is novel and stuff I didn't think about, but appreciate the engagement and looking forward to continuing to build through in this conversation. So so setting that groundwork and kind of building up to sort of the legal piece, I'm doing this next section, which is not purely legal either, but I think it's important. And why do I think it's important? So before I started teaching, I worked in New York for about 6 years. Half of that time I was doing stuff around work cooperatives. And in my last, let's say 12 months, maybe every 3 months or so, I had a different co-op coming to me saying, we're trying to get rid of one of our members. Different contexts, different things going on, but it was just like, she gotta go, he gotta go, so on and so forth. And the 2 things that it got me thinking about was, one, how are we moving through conflict in ways that aren't punitive? And two, even before conflict gets there, what's the healing work that we're not doing that even like allows for that stuff to bubble up in the first place? Okay. And so I started thinking about some organizing work that I was doing at the time, which was with Black Youth Project 100, BYP 100 in New York City. And we have been really intentional about integrating healing justice practices in our organizing, with the understanding that it's important to integrate that. And so what does this matter when it comes to work cooperatives? All right, so first thinking about integrating healing. Okay, so I want you to reflect on the questions below. So the first one, how has the law impacted your life positively and or negatively? The second one is, what healing do you still need to do around your relationship with the law? And the third and final question is, how might your relationship with the law show up within the cooperative, right? Whether we're talking about conflict resolution, or we're talking about decision making, how you think about hierarchy. How does your relationship with the law show up, or you anticipate it showing up when it comes to the cooperative? So what I like to do is just kind of go through each of these questions. If you have a response, you can feel free to throw out your response just by hopping off of mute. But when we move through this section, you'll understand a little bit more why I'm asking these questions. So the first one, how has the law impacted your life positively or negatively? Anyone want to chime in?
My family had a business and we ended up selling it to someone who never paid us. So we took them to court, but because they were, I don't remember the term, it was like fictitious something, they drug the court out until we couldn't afford to pay them anymore. So no matter who had the facts, it was the person who had more money. So I would say that's an impact that I've experienced.
Yeah, so one person, one party using legal procedure to get a win that on the substantive aspects maybe doesn't lead to a just outcome. Any other one of folks wanna share?
This is Asada. I'd say when you said this question, I was thinking about it, but I think my biggest relationship with the law is related to the crime bill that Bill Clinton signed. And I remember it, I was in school, but I remember being so upset about it and analyzing it in my political science class and talking to my cousins and my brother and Black men in my life, because I understood what it meant. And I remember Tupac, rapping about it. And I remember, I can still name some of the Black legislators. The only Black, senator voted for that crime bill. And I remember just feeling so just upset and so depressed for I want to say years of my life was marked by the crime bill. And that's, a strong, emotional driven memory I have about the law.
I appreciate you sharing that. And I asked about law generally because folks who are impacted by the criminal justice system start co-ops too, right? And there are ways in which folks who are impacted by our criminal justice system, by virtue of being impacted by it, are less able to start working cooperatives, right? And so just kind of how the law in all of its facets sort of impacts our lives and our ability to show up, which leads to the second question, which is, what healing do you feel like you still need to do around your relationship with the law?
I think it's really interesting that in this conversation about creating a cooperative, that this is coming up. One of the ideas behind the wellness modality cooperative is the idea that people need to feel well and whole
That part.
around all kinds of issues, not just physical, what's going on with the physical body, but whether it's mentally or financially or with the community, just whatever your issues are, how do you get back to wellness, a sense of wellness? And it's bringing up for me, I used to own a beauty supply distributorship with 6 stores, and the main store being, the police came in one day and just knocked down the doors and went to my brother's house and bashed his doors in looking for drugs and weapons. And there was nothing there. But there was also it was like they did it with impunity. There was no recourse that we had to how we recovered from that under the law in Baltimore about police. And so this brought that up, that deserves a healing. In terms of my own perspective, as I go forward with building this modalities cooperative, and to what other degree will other members have experiences and events that are going to affect their perspective on it.
And how they show up in the co-op.
And how they show up in the co-op.
And so that leads to the last question is, when you think about, and we don't have to have anyone answer this one unless someone wants to, but all these are things that are important to think about even before you legally form an entity, because depending on who you ask, right, like healing is a process, right? It's not like an endpoint that you get to per se, but it's important to surface these sorts of things to the extent that you can, and to the extent you have resources in your respective jurisdictions to kind of help you not only build the infrastructure that is sustainable legally, but also sustainable in terms of the relationships you all are building among yourselves, the relationship you have with yourself, so on and so forth.
Yes.
And so with that, I'm gonna just talk, what is healing justice? There's some different definitions out there. I think I got this one from Kara Page, I'm pretty sure somewhere. But healing justice is a framework that identifies how we can holistically respond to and intervene on generational trauma and violence, and to bring collective practices, so not individual, right, but collective practices that can impact and transform the consequences of oppression on our bodies, hearts, and minds. And so there are, folks, and there's some criticisms around certain terminology, around like who's a healing justice practitioner, so on and so forth. But there are folks who do work around how to do this work. I've often seen it in organizing spaces, and my understanding is a lot of this work was rooted in the idea around people burning out, particularly Black femmes in the South, dying at young ages because just the work to try to get Black folks in a better situation, and not taking into account the ways in which what they're experiencing in the work, but also what their ancestors experienced doing the work of just living life, sort of brings up in their bodies, hearts, and minds. But then how do we bring together collective practices that can help us transform with what's moving through? And so that's like I said, one of probably a couple of different definitions out there. And so why do I bring this up? So these are some things that I often suggest to clients that I work with. Is like some potential resources in terms of maybe thinking about how do you integrate healing, right? So if you're in Baltimore, is it Reverend Burnett?
Yes.
Yeah. Holler at Reverend Burnett and the Wellness Cooperative, right? And other sort of maybe local folks who are engaging in healing justice or healing practices, Reiki, some acupuncture, other things like that. But also maybe reading about it. And so there's a website here that you can check out, Transform Harm. I know Kara Page and some folks just came out with a book And so just thinking about how that integrates into your co-op. So for my cooperative, it's just me and my homie right now. We do like breath work, and when we do our like annual retreat, we kind of try to integrate some healing modalities and stuff like that. But also, you know, integrating into your actual meetings, right? So doing real check-ins of how folks are feeling, so on and so forth. And then, like I said, having a retreat space, if that's something you do, that integrates some healing. So these are just some offerings. Take with them, do with those what you wish. All right. And so shifting from sort of healing justice, I want to talk a little bit about restorative justice. And, you know, there's transformative justice out there as well. I'm not going to talk about restorative justice or transformative justice in part because I just need to think about it a little bit more myself. But you should feel free to look at transformative justice a little bit more if you want. But restorative justice is a response to wrongdoing that prioritizes repairing harm and recognizes maintaining positive relationships with others is a core human need, like the interdependence. It seeks to address the root causes of crime, even to the point of transforming unjust systems and structures. Which, depending on who you ask, they don't necessarily go that far in terms of systems and structures. But what's important here is the fact that it's thinking about how do you sort of repair harm, and not how do you punish people for doing something wrong, right? And so there are ways in which, as you're building out your cooperative, whatever it is you're doing, I try to encourage folks to come up with some kind of conflict resolution policy earlier than later, and to think through, you know, how do you consider maybe integrating sort of restorative justice elements where you're really thinking about how do you address the harm, think about the relationships, and understand it within this larger context, or which we've been talking about already. And here I got a couple other resources. Center for Family Life, they have a co-op guide that has some sample bylaws, and they have a decent conflict resolution policy that you could check out and deviate from. U.S. Federation Work Cooperatives has a guide. I feel like it's a little less useful, but they've got some stuff in there. I also encourage folks, and me and my co-op partner, we do role play sometimes to just be like, hey, you know, this is an agreement that we have. Let's say, you know, you broke it. How do we move through that in this moment right now? Let's kind of go through it, see how it feels in our body. Let's go through our process and see how it feels, right? And so, so I encourage that, building that muscle around engaging in principal struggle, engaging in conflict in ways that are using, language that helps build relationships versus destroys relationships. And then just reading about restorative justice. So here's a couple resources here. And restorative justice has been co-opted by the state. Right, they're in schools now. Police are apparently doing restorative justice stuff. So just know that that's an issue. And I think one of the benefits of transformative justice is that it's very much so rooted in like a critique of like the state kind of being involved and us moving through conflict. But I'll stop there. Any thoughts or reflections folks got around that before we get into the meat of the presentation, which is about what you all came here to actually talk about, which is, some of these legal considerations when forming a cooperative.
Well, we talked last week about making sure that there's an ongoing educational process within the cooperative. And I think this is one of the issues that should be addressed with members on that regular recurring basis. When new members come in, when members that are already there, just deal with it and just integrate it into the process. Just being mindful enough to integrate it into the process.
Mm-hmm. I hear that. Appreciate you lifting that up. Super important. particularly new
Yeah,
members?
I think it's also, this is a Black cooperative academy.
Yep.
And it's always thinking about, you know, why the cooperative model,
Mhm.
how is it different from people of African descent? And thinking about the history and just the lived experiences, right? And one of the things I just want to say that cooperatives are supposed to meet social, cultural, and economic needs. And usually in mainstream conversation about cooperative, we only focus on the economic, right? But the culture and the social, and I would say the culture and social are connected to this question of healing and healing practices, because also doing this work and just coming into relationship with people, as you said, harm is going to happen. Trauma is going to manifest. You know what I mean? Because that's just the nature of relationships in general. And similar to what the instructor talked about last week, if all of this is about relationship building, then attending to these things are important. So I really just appreciative, because I would say in my mind, when I go back with my circle member from the Crenshaw group, the works group, I'm gonna say, well, this is something that I learned, and I think it's something we should think about in the development of our education curriculum, which is supposed to be for Black people, right? So this idea that anything that's around, I think, cooperative education, this thing about healing is an important topic that I think deserves to be treated and focused on. So thank you for that, Julia.
No, thank you for uplifting that. Any last comments before we move into the next section? All right. All right. So this is the section that is gonna kind of be a bit more law heavy. And the way I try to go through this is I try to go through it sort of as a day in the life, a very expedited day in the life of your worker cooperative, for today at least, right? And so we're gonna have this fictitious cooperative. We're gonna call it, whoops, we're gonna call it Black Panther Productions. And what do? We produce media that educates and uplifts the Black community. We got one, two, well, whatever. Let's say we got 10 members, which will make more sense later why I picked that number. And in terms of the legal entity that we pick, like, are we a nonprofit? Are we a benefit corporation? Well, we don't know, because we're trying to figure it out, right? So here I would say it's close to an exhaustive list, not quite exhaustive, of a lot of the different legal entities out there in general. And so I bucket them in terms of unincorporated associations, right? So they're not corporations. There's some kind of association that is, a group of folks coming together. And then you got corporations, right? And so on the left-hand side, you got sole proprietorships if you're by yourself. You got general partnerships, which is if people kind of come together and they don't file anything with the state, they're just doing their thing. You got limited partnerships, which is another type of partnership. Some states, I want to say it's about 6 or 7 now, have limited cooperative associations, including DC, where I used to practice. I don't think California. I know California doesn't. I don't think Maryland does either. I'm not sure. LLCs, limited liability companies, and low profit limited liability companies. So LPLLCs. And so, and then you got like decentralized autonomous organizations, or DAOs, which are a legal entity in Wyoming, but whatever, we're not gonna talk about that. On the right side, you got corporations. So these are the entities where you typically file some kind of articles of incorporation, certificate of incorporation with the state entity, which is typically your Department of State. And you've got here a nonprofit corporation. I put it here, they're unable to distribute profits, right? Because they're nonprofit. They don't have profits to distribute, but they're able to bring in revenue. Obviously, they're able to bring in money and have a surplus, but there are no shareholders like in a traditional corporation to give those quote unquote profits to. Benefit corporations, most corporations in most states, the basic one, if you just form one, is a C corporation. S corporations are corporations that allow you to have a certain flexibility in terms of tax. You can be taxed as a partnership, but there's certain restrictions. And then New York has a worker cooperative corporation and a membership cooperative corporation. One of the things that I didn't put on here, Illinois has a limited worker cooperative association, which would have been on the left side. And so these are kind of some of the different options. Today we can't focus on all of them. Sorry. So these are the 5 that we're going to focus on. And when I say focus on, what I mean is that we're going to talk through the typical stages you would go through in terms of sort of the forming and operating of your cooperative, and what are the implications of these different entities, right? So if it's a general partnership versus a C corporation, what does that mean for taxes? What does that mean for labor laws, so on and so forth? And so, so let's say it's 9 a.m. We got together, we're ready to form, little tight on money. You know, they say another recession's coming, inflation's going out of this world, and you know, so we're trying to figure out how much would it cost to form an entity, right? And so this is a spectrum that is I would say generally accurate in terms of what's going to be your cheaper options versus your more expensive options. As I was mentioning before, general partnerships are basically the default for if 2 or more people get together and just start selling some kind of service or selling some sort of product. Most states have a general partnership kind of law, but you don't have to actually file anything anywhere, right? So in terms of formation, you don't have to pay the $220 or in some places $150 to file some sort of certificate with the state. You don't have to. And so that's going to be your cheapest option because you don't really have to kind of pay anything to form. Now, you might want to get some insurance, some liability insurance, but that would be the case probably for all these entities. So that's why, relatively speaking, it's going to be your cheapest option. Then you've got all the other ones, LCAs, C corporations, worker cooperative corporations, limited liability companies. Sometimes they can be a little bit more expensive. So like in New York, which is not relevant for you all, there's an extra fee you have to pay with an LLC. But typically these 4 entities are all going to be around the same range in terms of price. And so you have to pay a fee to be officially recognized. You usually get a Department of State identification number. And with that number, you can then get a tax ID typically, right? So you'll file, get your sort of Department of State number, and then you'll be able to go to the IRS to get a tax identification number, okay? And so, and you can do that with a general partnership as well. But this would be the relative costs with respect to these different entities. Any questions or comments on that? And nonprofit would fall, you know, on the right end of the spectrum. I'll say one thing that I didn't say earlier is that I didn't put B Corps on here. B Corp is and benefit corporation, which is on here. Those are 2 different things. A benefit corporation is actually a legal entity. There's a section in the state law that lays out how to form a benefit corporation. What are the requirements in terms of your board of directors? What are the defaults in terms of voting? How do you do the bylaws, so on and so forth? A B Corp is actually a designation, right? So a B Corp is a designation given by a third-party organization whereby you fill out some paperwork and you agree to abide by certain practices. You have to make certain modifications sometimes to your formation document in some instances. And if you do those things and you continue to do those things, you can be B Corp certified, or you be B Corp, the B Corp designation. And so you can be a C corporation and be a B Corp. You can be an S corporation, be a B Corp. You can be any of these different entities and have that designation, right? But it's not in and of itself a legal entity. Okay, benefit corporation is a legal entity, and typically, similarly to B Corp, you're trying to integrate other interests aside from just profit. So typically you're taking into account other stakeholders, your workers, your community. And with benefit corporations, typically you actually have to put together like a report every year that has to go to the Department of State. There's certain formulas you got to put together. And so it can be a bit more involved than sort of getting B Corp designation. But I wanted to kind of make that clear since that was a question, that was a comment that came up at the outset. So that's all I have with respect to costs. Kimberly, what you got?
Yeah, so when you're first starting out, can you loan the co-op money?
Yeah, so we'll talk a little bit about other considerations like financing. The short answer is you can, and you'll just have to make sure the documentation reflects that, and that you kind of reflect that in your books as well, right? Because there's a difference between someone, let's say they have a regular membership share, but maybe you have a separate class of members that are investors, and you say, oh, you can also like buy an investor share as well, right? And so you can get money both as a regular member owner and as an investor class owner. Or you could do what you said like before, which is like give a loan, but you have to just make sure that you do the analysis to make sure that the law doesn't treat that as a security. Because if it's a security, which we'll talk about a little bit later, that might trigger certain types of reporting obligations.
Okay.
I'll touch a little bit more in depth on that a little bit later.
Okay.
Well, good question. Appreciate it. Any other questions that folks got around formation costs? All right, cool. So now 9 a.m. We talked about the cost. We figured out which thing we wanted to form. We formed the thing. We filed our certificate. We filed our articles. And so now we're trying to figure out who's going to govern this thing. Who are our members? What are the classes? What are their rights, obligations, so on and so forth. So now I'm going to switch and talk about governance. And governance is basically going to be the ways in which you sort of operate the organization. So it's really about sort of the bigger ticket issues with the formation, in terms of making sure that the organization moves toward the values, moves toward the goals that are being set out by the worker owners, or if it's multi-stakeholder by the different stakeholders. And so here I laid out again the different entities on the left, and then talk a little bit about flexibility and also what the governance document would be. So this kind of tracks what we talked a little bit about earlier when it comes to formation costs. So general partnerships are going to be your most flexible. Again, as long as you just got a couple people and you just out here selling some things, you are a partnership. You don't even have to have a partnership agreement. Okay, you should, but technically you don't have to. So you can just be out here doing your thing, and or you can kind of put together a partnership agreement, and it could be very flexible in terms of how you operate. The next most flexible entity when it comes to governance would be a limited liability company, LLC. And what their document is called is an operating agreement. Sometimes you also have a membership agreement between the actual members themselves. And in this context, the workers are going to be members as opposed to shareholders. They don't require a board of directors. You oftentimes don't even have a requirement to have like an annual meeting. And so you can have a lot of flexibility. You can have a bunch of different classes in your operating agreement, so on and so forth. So that's the next most flexible. Once you get into the corporate forms, so any worker cooperative corporation, C corporation, LCA, then you have to have bylaws. There's will be the document will be called. You have to have a board of directors. Typically, you have to have an annual shareholders meeting, an annual board meeting. You have to kind of elect your board members. You have to lay that kind of stuff out. And with each of the worker cooperative corporation and C corporation, the workers are going to be shareholders. Is going to be the terminology that you would use. And again, there's relatively strict requirements when it comes to corporate form as it relates to LLC or general partnership. LCAs, their workers are called members because they're still an association. They're not a corporate form. But they do include a lot of the corporate governance requirements that you would see in a traditional corporation or a work part of a corporation, such that the governance rules are going to be a bit less flexible. And so what does that mean when it comes to if we need to file anything? And this is related to what I was talking about earlier in response to Kimberly's question. When you think about having a multi-stakeholder cooperative, which I believe that was something that Asada had mentioned, you want to make sure that you think carefully about what are called securities law issues. And so what's a security? A security is, in the most basic form, it's some sort of investment instrument whereby the person who made the investment is expecting something back in return, some sort of return. Can't hear you. Can folks hear me?
We can
I
hear
can.
you. Yeah. Okay, good.
You couldn't hear me before?
Yes.
Oh, okay. All right. No, I'm just saying Asia says she can't hear me. But Asia, you can hear me now. Okay, cool. So so securities are these any kind of investment that someone makes in a company whereby you're expecting some kind of return. So your most typical type of security would be what? If you wanted to have some ownership in Apple, what would you buy?
Or share.
Stock.
Or share.
Yeah, stock, shares, right? And so that's a type of security. Another type of security, and so that's equity because you have some ownership. You can also buy debt, and right, so municipal bonds are an example of like a debt security. You can also have companies issue bonds as well, and then you got all these other things, warranties, and other things right there. So all those can be securities. When you become a worker owner in a company, that you have a share, or if it's an association, you have a membership unit, which is technically a security, right? Because you have an ownership interest whereby, depending on if you have profits, you're entitled to some of that profit as an owner. Now, in most states, you're going to have an exemption with respect to your just a typical worker cooperative with the worker owners, right? Because the workers are not passive investors. Typically, passivity is an element that's taken into account. And the workers are going to be, doing work. They're not just putting in money with the expectation of investment. They're the ones who are benefiting themselves. And so in most instances, you're going to be good, but you want to just make sure you check in with someone. Members in training, probationary members, provisional members, whatever you want to call them. Those are fairly common among different entities. They typically are a class of member sometimes as well, to avoid them being treated as employees. And so maybe they have like half a vote, or maybe they have sort of other types of rights, whether it's financial rights in terms of profits, in addition to some of the worker owners. But sometimes they're their own class within the cooperative. Inactive, I don't see that very often to have that as a class. So you're typically good on the first two. When it comes to having investors, when it comes to having consumers, and when it comes to having community members who have ownership stakes, you just want to make sure that you have a lawyer just look at both the federal and state securities law issues just to make sure that you're good. What's typically going to be the case is those investments are going to be securities. However, depending on who in the community is going to be able to have a share, depending on where they live, certain dynamics, you can sometimes get an exemption. So even though it's a security, you might be exempt from having to do the type of reporting that's typically required. And so that might mean you file like 1 or 2 documents with, with the state securities agency. And so I would just say, talk to a lawyer about that kind of stuff when you're thinking about multiple like classes, just to make sure you're good from a securities law standpoint. I think that's all I have around governance. So I know, Asada, you had asked about multi-stakeholder stuff. I don't know if you have any kind of follow-up questions from that, or if anyone else has any questions around the conversation around governance.
No, that's very helpful in the way you broke it down about the security part. Really, I've thought about membership and what we call investor shares and, equity. But I just appreciate the way you explained it in a very direct, like common sense way. So thank you for that.
You're very welcome. That's why they pay me the big bucks. They don't, but they should.
Yeah, Julia, let me say this though, in reflecting, because you said, about equity, right? And this idea that if we're doing stuff in a community for community members to benefit, then I like the idea that residents in that community, because I think that makes a difference to like most nonprofits, right? Most nonprofits are are set up to be accountable to their board, right? The board, it has the accountability and really make the major decisions in the organization. Most times, not always. But I like the idea that if we're trying to have a model that explicitly benefits residents, and then giving them some equity, some skin in the game, and also some governance, right? Makes sense to kind of building our community. And I must say, dealing with that trauma, because I think it's people who've always been owned and dictated by and dominated by the law against our will, giving people more ownership of their lives is, I think, healing and reparative. So I just like the way you said that. And that's why I just keep thinking multi-stakeholder cooperatives are the way to go when we're doing something that we say is explicitly for and in proximity to communities.
Yeah, and I'll just say to add, there are community rounds that people do. Typically, if you do like an intrastate offer, which basically means like in your state, that's oftentimes in state securities laws and exemption, right? So if you're in Maryland, and the only people who can invest are the folks who are in like a 4-block radius of your cooperative. Then oftentimes you have to check. You'll be able to sort of get an exemption. And so I don't say this to discourage you all from having multiple stakeholders. It's just I want you to make sure you just talk with someone just to be sure, because it might just be again like filing a couple documents, but the implications of not doing that can be like you might have to unwind everything, right? I've seen this happen when I was doing some up council work a couple years ago, and this company was out doing their thing, wanted some investors, got money from maybe people from 5 or 6 different states, didn't really talk to anyone about it. And we're like, okay, what do we do now? And one of the things that ended up being probably one of the most practical solutions was actually to unwind everything, or to kind of pay like a very significant fine and kind of explain things, so on and so forth. So thank you for that.
Now, is that primarily when you're profit making? If you're a nonprofit cooperative, can you solicit from other people in other states or?
Yeah, so those will just be like donations. And
okay.
Typically what you'll do is you'll form your nonprofit, you'll do your governance stuff, select the board, and then you'll probably apply for 501c3 status, submit your 1023. Once you get that, then you'll have to typically do like a charitable solicitations process in your state.
Okay.
That way you can kind of get money from folks in your state. And then just depending on the state where you're like soliciting and kind of what the level of solicitation you're doing in other states, you may have to do some other additional filings in those jurisdictions, but it kind of depends. But typically, yeah, when people would give donations to a nonprofit, they wouldn't have any sort of equity or any kind of governance rights over the entity. The way in which you would have kind of what Asada was talking about earlier in the context of a nonprofit would be if it's a board and membership based nonprofit, where the members depending on how you operate it, function like shareholders, right? So they can, they have to be folks, they have to vote on who's on the board, for example, or they have to sign off on certain big decisions. And so a lot of nonprofits just have a board and that's it. But you can also have a board with members, and the members, you would be accountable to them in a way that sometimes, as Asada mentioned before, is not really the case when it's kind of a board operated nonprofit. And the Sustainable Economies Law Center, or SELC, based in the Bay, they've got some good materials on worker self-directed nonprofits, which are, it's an attempt to have a much flatter version of a nonprofit that integrates a lot of the elements, particularly around governance, like democratic decision making, that you would see in a cooperative, but for the fact that there's no profit to distribute. So cooperatives, it's about democratic decision making, and it's about giving the profits to the people who are actually producing them, like the patrons, the workers.
Right.
So you can do the first part with the democratic decision making with a nonprofit, but you just can't do the second part because you don't have any profits to distribute. So they have a good resource that you might want to check out.
And who is that again?
I'm gonna put it in the chat.
Okay, thanks.
And would that be the impetus for the nonprofit to create a for-profit arm which would operate as the co-op, or no? Like, because there's some nonprofits that actually have businesses like that pay back into the nonprofit.
Yeah,
Is that something?
We'll cover that once we get to other considerations. But yeah.
Okay, gotcha. Okay.
It could look a couple different ways. So I have it written down. We will talk about that for sure. All right. Anything else on governance? Are we good?
Good.
All right, y'all want to take like a 10-minute break? Is that cool, Ron? Folks want to take a break, or you want me to just keep going? So and end early.
I don't know. I'm on a roll. I say we keep going, but I don't want to be selfish if anybody else wants to take a break.
I say keep going too.
We most of us from Baltimore, so we,
We used to.
We can keep going.
Okay. Well, I don't know if the people who got their screens off are here anyway. So do what you got to do. So let's say we formed your entity. You come together. You've done your bylaws in an hour, which every cooperative I've ever worked with, it only takes an hour to do your bylaws. I'm joking. It takes way longer.
Yeah, because takes a lot longer to go through all of that. Okay.
But today we did it from 10 a.m. to 11 a.m. And now we got to talk about liability because someone came to the set, slipped and fell, and we got to figure out who's liable, right? And so what does that look like with respect to these different entities? So I want to talk a little bit about the concept of limited liability. So limited liability, if we wanted to think about that context, so let's say person who slipped and fell, sued us in court, $25,000 with their owed medical expenses. Judge is like, yes, they're liable. Now, let's say we only got $15,000 in our account. It's Black Panther Productions, right? You go to our account at our credit union, right? Cooperative among cooperatives, $15,000 in there. And so that's not $25,000. But, I'm going to just call on someone, Lynn, let's just say Lynn's like big baller out here, got the piggy bank with just 10 stacks is chilling, And the person who slipped and fell is like, yo, I know Lynn has 10. We do the 10 plus the 15, make me whole. What's going on, right? Simple mathematics, right? Now, limited liability, the way that would work, my animation isn't working. But typically, what would happen is the limited liability or your legal entity serves as a shield, okay? And so when that claim comes, I'm just doing my finger, and you can kind of see it. It comes and it's trying to get that 10 stacks from Lynn. It gets hit, it hits the shield, and they can only get the 15. And the reason is that the underlying philosophy is that if you're doing business and providing a service, providing a product through your business, you should be personally liable if something happens within the context of you doing that, doing your business, okay? And so even if the claim wins and it's $25,000, if you got limited liability, the judge will say you only get 15. We can't, Lynn, we can't do Lynn like that. That's not what she signed up for. Like, come on, right? Now, not every entity has limited liability. Okay, and so general partnership, again, that's the one where you don't file anything. You're just out here living your best life. You know, out here doing these wellness, you know, sessions, doing some Reiki. You know, out here maybe, you know, working on some acupuncture. You know, people get injured and they try to sue you for your general partnership. Then, unless you got some general liability insurance, those members will be liable. In the context of all the other entities that we've talked about, you do enjoy limited liability, okay? Now, there are some exceptions. If you claim that you're working within the context of doing the film stuff that we do, but you actually were out kicking it with your homegirl or your homeboy, use the company car and hit somebody, right? If it's not within the auspices of doing the work, you might not necessarily get limited liability. If you're like defrauding people, if you're not paying people like their wages, right? There are ways in which you can actually, it's called piercing the corporate veil, whereby you can actually be personally liable. And so just something to take into account. Any questions on limited liability or comments? Hopefully no horror stories.
We have a question. Go ahead.
Sure. So when you open up a business and you get a business bank account and they ask you for personal information, are they piercing the veil by asking your personal information to open up that account when it should be a corporate account?
Not necessarily. It depends on what the information is, because you're gonna have to have someone who is going to be the person who's going to be the who's the person who can actually come in and make deposit, who can take money out of the account, right? So they'll need to have some information around who are the people who are authorized to engage with the account. And I mean, you can ask the bank those questions, but that wouldn't strike me as like, oh, this means that I could be personally liable. Now, yeah, as a general matter, but I'm trying to think of like if there's a situation where you're like defrauding the bank, like if you're doing something where you're mixing and mingling funds between your personal account and that account, and they feel like you're like, you know, something's going on there. Maybe that's a universe where you could have some liability vis-a-vis the bank, but that in and of itself isn't like piercing corporate veil.
Thank you.
Of course. Any other questions or comments? We are on a roll. All right, cool. So now we took care of that. Let's say we had limited liability. Lynn's got her 10 stacks. She's good, you know, boom, boom, bing. And, you know, but it's 1 o'clock now, all right? So we got to get ready to process these payments, make sure we're handling our employee year-related insurance. And so one of the questions you need to think about is, are we as worker owners, are we employees under the law? And what does that mean? Okay. So labor law is very complicated. This is a very truncated conversation about labor law. There's federal labor law, there's state labor laws, depending on where you live. There could be city labor laws, like New York City has its own labor laws. And there are different standards that courts and agencies will take into account to determine whether or not someone is an employee or someone is just merely like an owner, right? Whereby they're not an employee and the organization is not an employer. One factor to take into account is control. A lot of the tests think about control. And what do I mean by control? Does someone have the ability to hire and fire you? Is there someone who's basically your supervisor that you got to report to? Are you actually able to influence what's going on in the cooperative? Or are you just like someone who's there, like taking notes, and clearly being treated as someone who's not able to engage in this sort of democratic decision making that your peers are involved in? And was that intentional? In a context where it's clear that there's a control dynamic whereby someone in the cooperative doesn't have control over what they're doing, in that context, you're running the risk of there being an employer-employee relationship. On this spectrum that you see here, I say typically non-employees when it comes to LLCs and general partnerships. And I say typically employees when we're talking about C corporations and worker cooperative corporations, because if there's issues around control, where there's a member who's clearly in a very subservient employee-like relationship vis-a-vis other people, whether it's an LLC or a general partnership is not going to save you, right? You can still fail the test and have someone be deemed an employee, and labor laws are laws that you do not want to mess with. I had a situation with one client. It was in a nonprofit context, but they misclassifying someone who should be an employee. It could be a financial issue, and it could also sometimes lead to personal liability. Okay, so just make sure as you're thinking things through, you kind of do that analysis with your attorney. But like I said, these are kind of some of the things that are sort of typical among these different entities. But what does that mean, right? Employee, blah, 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 whatever. Okay, cool. So what does that mean is that if you have an employee-employee relationship, you got to start dealing with employment laws, right? So that means depending on what you're doing, paying people minimum wage, making sure you got workers' compensation, making sure you got disability insurance, depending on how many people are in the formation, overtime, vacation, so on and so forth. And then from an immigration standpoint, that means that people need to have I-9 verification. And so like you got to make sure that if you're going to be bringing members on, that they have the proper documentation, which for some types of cooperatives is something that is a very important thing to think about when they're thinking about, do we want to be an employer or not, right? That may be something that you all care about, it might not be. But these are the things you want to take into account in terms of what the implications are. And so if you are an employer and you have like 5 members, you probably need to get workers' compensation. That could be a cost that, although is beneficial vis-a-vis the folks who are the members, right? It can be something that's hard to deal with when in the context of like in your first couple of years. And so there's this tension here between labor laws that's really intended to protect people who in the traditional context are being exploited for their labor and are not able to enjoy certain benefits, be able to take breaks, so on and so forth. And then you have these sort of cooperative institutions that are meant to empower workers, but might not necessarily have the financial means, at least at the outset, to maybe do some of the things that an employer would do. And so there's no right answer per se. I think if you try to be exploitive, then it's like that's messed up. But there are different practical things you need to take into account that might just make it hard to sort of deal with some of the requirements that might come from being an employer. Any questions on that?
Nope.
Comments? All right. Well, we'll have some time at the end in case things come up. All right, so we got employees taken care of. Maybe we don't have employees. Maybe we do. I don't know. But now it's 5 p.m. We got to figure out this tax situation. It's tax season. We have profits of, let's say, $10,000 this year. And so the question now is, how will we be taxed? Well, I don't know. Let's see. All right, cool. So there are 3 common internal revenue codes that are relevant when it comes to sort of taxation when we're talking about cooperatives. And so one of those subchapters is subchapter C, right? And this is typical for like just your regular corporate taxation. So what does this mean? So let's say again, it says income, it probably should say profit, but whatever. So you got profit of $10,000. So the way I like to think about and explain how taxation generally works, and how it generally works is by bifurcating the entity and whether or not the entity is being taxed, and then the individual owners and whether or not they're being taxed. So as we go through these 3 different examples, I'll be breaking it down based on those two levels. All right, so level 1, when we're talking about corporate taxation, that $10,000 is taxed at the entity level. So all $10,000, I forget what the corporate tax rate is, like, like low 20s or something like that right now. And so, boom, that percentage taken out. But then on top of that, let's say we wanted to distribute half of that money. So $5,000, we wanted to distribute that as profits to our worker owners. Okay. That $5,000 that's going to those individuals. So it's 10 of us. So what's that? $250 each. We each get $250. Assuming that we all did the same amount of work, you know, you don't have to give the exact same amount of dividends. You can give it based on patronage, which is based on how much work people actually did, which is different from your typical capital dividends in a traditional corporation. But let's say everyone gets $250. All right, cool. You individually get taxed on that $250. And so what that means, and you might have heard this concept of double taxation. What that means is that functionally $15,000 is being taxed. $10,000 is being taxed from a corporate level, but then within that $10,000, that $5,000 that we're taking out and then distributing, it gets taxed again on your personal tax level, right? So 30-some%, depending on where you're at. And so, so that $5,000 is taxed 2 times, corporate level and on the individual level. So that's where the concept of double taxation comes in. Any questions or comments on that?
Is I got it, but why is it taxed twice?
That's how the code is set up.
Oh.
Telling the way the
Okay,
context.
got it.
Yeah.
The rhyming, I'm sorry, the rhyming reasons that they just want to take our money.
That's code for double dipping.
That's what I was thinking. I'm like, why? But okay, I get it.
That's double.
It is what it is.
And we get penalized for double dipping.
Oh, okay, gotcha.
Oh.
Thanks.
So now let's move to the second common type of taxation, which is partnership taxation. That's under subchapter K of the code. Now, mind you, I'm not a tax expert, but I know enough to kind of give some of the general sort of tidbits. I will say when it comes to partnership taxation, which is common among LLCs. So what we just talked about with corporate taxation is common among C corporations, which is sort of your generic corporation. Partnership taxation is common among LLCs, general partnerships. If you have an LCA, that could be your default. So those different things. And so we're going to look at it again on the entity level and then on the individual level. And it's worth noting in New York, for example, they do have a tax at the entity level that is not typically the case, right? So on the corporate level, you typically do not get taxed with respect to that. So like that $10,000 is, let's say, in our LLC account, it doesn't get taxed through any kind of corporate tax level. What you end up having is called pass-through taxation. So that entire $10,000, the tax on that money is paid by the individuals. So if we think about the last example, we distributed $5,000 to the owners. And let's say in this example, we do the same thing. We distribute 5,000. But what that means is we also retained 5,000, right? And that's cool, but that doesn't mean we don't have to pay taxes on that 5,000. So the 5,000 that we actually received, so that $250, right? Again, that we received, we have to pay taxes on that in this context. However, we also have to pay taxes on that other $5,000 that the LLC is technically retaining. And so with that, the concept that typically draws up for folks is what's called ghost income tax, right? So it's like you're being taxed on this income that is retained by the LLC, but you don't actually get it. So you're being taxed on income on money that doesn't actually hit your personal account. Okay, and so What that means is that, again, your individual tax rate is going to be higher than your corporate tax rate. And so once you get to a certain size, I've had clients in the past that were LLCs switch to a corporate form so that they could kind of have sort of the double taxation, because from a tax standpoint, it was more beneficial to have the double taxation, whereby you kind of have like the amount that's being taxed that's retained being taxed at a much lower rate. But again, you want to talk to your CPA or your accountant to figure that out. But that's kind of typically the case. But what that means is that what's total, a total amount that's taxed is just 10,000. So you don't have that extra amount of money being taxed twice. It's all taxed once, but it's all taxed to people's individual tax rate. Any questions or comments on that? All right. And so as a cooperative, you can have what's called subchapter T taxation, which is cooperative taxation. And worker cooperative corporations can use that. If you have a limited cooperative association that's taxed as a corporation, you can enjoy this particular type of taxation. And essentially, you get to avoid double taxation. And what do I mean by that? So at the corporate level, the money that's retained, that $5,000, is the amount that's taxed. On the individual level, right, again, we're still distributing that $5,000 for every example. The individuals have to pay taxes on that $5,000. And so what that means is that the total tax amount is $10,000 instead of $15,000, which is what we had with the traditional corporate tax rate. Because what happens is the amount of money that is distributed, you're able to deduct that from your corporate tax rate if you have subchapter T as your tax, as your sort of the code that you're operating with. And so as opposed to being taxed at 10,000 at the corporate tax level, it goes down to 5,000 because you distribute half of it. So that means that $5,000 doesn't get taxed twice, which was the case before. And in order to benefit from subchapter T, there are a couple of things you need to take into account. But the main thing is that you have to distribute dividends based on patronage. And patronage could be how many hours people worked. It could be how much money people brought in. It could be a combination of any of those, and maybe how many contracts people brought in. But essentially, whatever the metric is that you use to measure how much people worked, right? So whatever metric we use to figure out, okay, how much did Reverend Burnett work compared to Kimberly, compared to Eartha, right? Is hours, is that the best metric for us to tell? All right, cool. If we look at the hours, Reverend Burnett worked 50% of the hours that we worked, and Kimberly worked 40%, and Eartha was just taking vacations all the time and wasn't around 10% of the hours, right? So as long as you have a metric that's based on giving profits based on what people's contribution is, and to Asada's point earlier, if it's a multi-stakeholder cooperative, for consumer members, it would be, how much did you consume? If it was like a producer cooperative, or you have producer members, like how much did you produce? And so whatever that metric is, typically if it's based on sort of how much they patronize the actual entity, you can typically enjoy subchapter T taxation, but you want to consult your local lawyer just to be sure. All right, so some other considerations to take into account. Proposed timing, again, you want to get yourself right first, which is what we were talking about before with thinking about healing and thinking about restorative justice. You want to build your team's culture and agreements, discuss questions relevant to your governance. So I typically give people questionnaires where we ask about, what do you want quorum to be? What do you want voting to be? What do you want the classes of members to be? And you kind of discuss those questions among your group, so that way you have some consensus, some consent, some majority, whatever it is your approach is. Develop questions around it, and then consult an attorney. And that way you can kind of come with really informed thoughts. You can come with some results from some principled struggle that you can kind of work through, and then they can help you work on your governance document and form your legal entity. Now, you don't have to have your governance document done to form a legal entity. I typically recommend it just to make sure you're good. Another issue is financing, so loans and loan agreements, which you talked about a little bit before. You can give a loan to the cooperative yourself. You just want to make sure you have someone do the securities analysis, and that you make sure that you document it in ways that are going to take that into account. One of the major differences between equity and a loan is also if things go left and you become bankrupt, the lenders are the folks who typically have priority over the shareholders. So if there's $5,000 left after you go bankrupt and you had a loan for $5,000, but also people had invested, let's say, $30,000 across your members, that $5,000 typically will go to your creditors. And so if you're someone who made a loan, right, then you benefit from having a bit more priority if something goes left. And then, friends, family, community investment we talked about before, have someone do the securities assessment to make sure you get whatever exemption, you file whatever you need to make sure that you're able to get financing in that way to help you come together. Partnerships, you want to think about nonprofit developers. Obviously, you got Ron and the Network for Development Conscious Communities. Other types of nonprofit TA providers, whether they provide legal support, marketing support, social media stuff, so on and so forth. And then each other, right? So stay in contact with each other, lean on each other in terms of figuring out how to support each other. So that's my presentation. I'll talk briefly about the question around nonprofits and working with for-profits and sort of what you might call joint ventures. So there are a couple ways in which I've seen nonprofits engage with for-profits. One is your typical sort of incubator sort of process where you kind of have a nonprofit and then you have a project within that nonprofit that is sort of forming a worker cooperative that might be providing some sort of service, might be providing some sort of product. In that context, you just have to make sure that the charitable purpose of your nonprofit is in line with giving money to that type of entity or helping that type of entity form, and making sure that that you kind of make sure that documentation is in place. So there's a universe where you sort of have the project, you have the kind of co-op start off as sort of a project with a nonprofit. A second model that I've seen is where you have sort of a nonprofit that kind of is sort of like it could be an informal or a formal relationship with the for-profit cooperative, and that could look like providing services or funding. And again, the key issue, among others, you want to just make sure you talk to someone about it, is making sure that the money that's coming to the nonprofit is being used to further its charitable purpose. So, for example, what's an example of that? So let's say your charitable purpose for the nonprofit is to support youth with opportunities to engage in the arts. And so maybe you're having a youth group put together an arts cooperative where they all have art that they make, and the money that the nonprofit gets is to help them get the materials, boom, 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 maybe do some classes, but they can also then sell their art, maybe make some money for the cooperative, right? One of the key issues there is you got to make sure there's a distinction between the leadership in those two entities, right? So you got to make sure there's no conflicts of interest. So whoever's on the board for the nonprofit should not be a member of the cooperative, right? And if that is the case, making sure you have your conflict of interest policy in place and you go through the process of documenting, excluding those people from making the decisions, and making sure that you do that responsibly to the extent there is someone who's conflicted. Because you can still engage in the transaction, but there's a certain documentation you'll have to do, procedures, research you'll have to do as a nonprofit to make sure that you don't have any issues later with using the funds inappropriately. And then the third thing that I've seen has been fiscal sponsorship, which I guess is it's very similar to the first one, but it's kind of more formal, where the for-profit worker cooperative might be, getting some sort of support from the nonprofit. And I guess the fourth relationship is just like as a vendor. Like the nonprofit basically hires the worker cooperative as like a vendor, provider of some sort of service. And so there's that, or you could do sort of a joint venture, which is like an agreement between the two, where the where the nonprofit is providing a certain funds that typically aren't guaranteed, but you know, case by case, provided, assuming that the assessment is made that this is the best use of funds and services purpose. I've also seen, I'm going into option 6 now. I've also seen nonprofits where they're like the owner or one of the owners of a cooperative, but then it's not really a cooperative. It's kind of something a little bit different, because the nonprofit isn't a worker, right? But it depends. It would be a multi-stakeholder cooperative, and in that case, the money from the cooperative could go to the nonprofit in terms of donation. Those are a couple things. I don't know if that's helpful.
Yes, that was helpful. You offered some other scenarios that at least I wasn't aware of. And so we have some research to do. So thank you.
Cool. Well, that's it in my presentation. If folks got questions, comments, I can stick around until we end this out. Ryan, anything you wanted me to cover that I didn't cover that you want left up?
I sent them copies of bylaws and articles of incorporation. Do we forward it to them, Anna? Okay. Yeah, so they have their draft documents they can at least begin to examine when time comes that they choose to incorporate their entities.
Okay. All right.
Well, kudos, man. You did a good job.
Great presentation. I was about to say, it's really good.
Thank you, Julia. Thank you.
Yeah. Got into the mechanics of, I like the way you eased us into that, you know, that heady part of it with all those different, yeah, I like the way you presented that. Thank you very much.
My pleasure.
A lot to consider.
It's true, but nothing y'all can handle.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Let's do it. Yep, just do it.
Yeah, and y'all have I think yeah, y'all have a copy of the presentation. It's the same one I did last time, Anna, so you can feel free to share it with folks.
Oh, that's much appreciated.
All right. Well, go ahead. Does someone want to say something? Go ahead, Elizabeth. Go ahead. Unmute yourself.
Yeah, I'm so sorry that the fostering these twins and it just took up all this time, and I'm sorry to be late. Can I ask a stupid question since I just came into the meeting?
Ask your question.
Okay, are there any reasons not just to use an LLC?
Number of them that I talked about today. So I would say, yeah, I would just say take a look at the presentation, maybe look at the video. Yeah, I mean, in terms of depending where's your cooperative at? What state are you in?
California, Los Angeles, California.
Yeah, so you know, there's a cooperative statute in California, and there's some benefits that you get from that you don't get from an LLC, from a taxation standpoint, from a securities law standpoint. I think there's an exemption that they have in the law there, securities exemption. There are different types of membership classes that you might want to have, which you don't necessarily get with the LLC. But yeah, but there's some pros for LLCs as well in terms of like from a legal law standpoint, from a flexibility standpoint in terms of governance. But I'll go into more detail in that.
Sorry about being late.
No worries. Well, it's recorded.
Good to see you.
Ah, well, it seems like you, if there's no more questions, we'll let you go, Julian, and thank you for your time and your expertise, and if folks have further questions, should I share? Can they reach out to you?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay, all right, well, good, all right.
All right, well, it was nice meeting y'all. Best of luck. If I can be a resource, let me know. I know lawyers in a lot of places. So unfortunately, there aren't a lot of co-op lawyers, so I can't guarantee people have capacity. But
Yeah.
let me drop. There's a link. There's a Cooperative Professionals Guild database that you can use to search up lawyers in your particular jurisdiction. So what I'm gonna do is I'll pass that to you, Ryan, because I don't have it ready.
Okay.
But it
Right.
seems like we should make a subset of that for, specifically Black professionals, co-op professionals.
Can you say that again? I didn't catch that.
It seems like we should make a subset of that list, for specifically Black co-op professionals.
Yeah, it's gonna be a real short list.
But we have to start somewhere,
Well, at the conference this year, we're having, for the first time, we're having a discussion with HBCU law schools.
Cool.
Yeah, yeah. So yeah.
Now,
so-
is that because HBCUs have cooperative centers, or is it to influence them to consider taking that on?
to influence them to take it on?
Okay,
Yeah, because many of them they don't. So,
okay,
yeah, so that's just the beginning of the conversation.
excellent. That's excellent.
So we got two of the schools, two of the 6 Black HBCU law schools participating.
Excellent.
Which ones, Ron?
FAMU and Southern University.
Okay. Yeah, I'm not gonna be able to make it. I'm gonna be out of the country, but
Yeah, you're back traveling again.
we'll connect though.
Yeah, we'll connect.
Send us some good minds. Influence some people to come to the conference. Send us some good minds.
Yes. All right. Well, we're at the conclusion of today's session, folks. So, and again, I thank Julian for sharing his expertise with us. Hopefully, it spurred you to rethink or think longer about how you may see this work in its connection legally to what you're trying to do. So we'll end today's session. And is there anything you want to wrap up with sharing with folks?
Yep. For next week's session, the topic is going to be developing a financeable business plan, and the presenter will be Hans Petit Morgan, who works at JP Morgan Chase. He is the I believe senior vice president and the consultant there. So that will be our next week's session.
All right.
Excellent.
All right.
Very
Great.
good.
Good.
Thanks, Julian.
Thank you, Julian.
Thank
Thank you,
you.
everyone. Eve, I
See
see
you tomorrow, Julian. See you
Wonderful.
tomorrow, Ron. See you
Yeah.
tomorrow.
Yeah, see you tomorrow, Silas.
Eve. Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.
Hey, good night.